From our early days, we have always been in search of the truth. From the time we were 3 asking Mom, but why, to our independent and rebellious teenage days of questioning authority, we looked to many sources for truth. But how do we know truth? And whose truth is it? Our search for truth will first look at what is news. Then, to whose news is it? Can the truth be reported? Who's a real journalist? And finally, how do you recognize truth? We begin with what is news. News has taken many avenues, from the schoolyard shooting in Arkansas, to the death of Princess Diana, to the Kentucky Wildcats national championship. But let's look at how news can be defined. Firsts. The need to be on the cutting edge, to explore and conquer remains a news fascination for all of us. Firsts are news. War. The conflict between ideas, between countries, and between neighbors sometimes leads to confrontation. War is news. Peace. With every conflict and confrontation, we hope for peace. The peace in our minds, the peace in our hearts, and the peace for the future. Peace is news. Breakthroughs. Our need to make the future better leads us to a one-of-a-kind discoveries. Breakthroughs are news. Life. From your first steps to your first days of school, life has its trials, its happy moments, and its surprises. Life is news. Death. With those first steps also comes the sometimes harsh reality of death, whether it be a parent, a brother or a sister, a close friend or a celebrity. Death is news. Love. Those spectacular romances, famous courtships, and high school sweethearts. Love is news. Hate. While there is love, we also experience hate. Hate in terms of violence, hate in terms of prejudice, and hate in terms of discrimination. Hate is news. Sacrifice. How far would you go for the news? Would you be suspended from school? Would you leave your surroundings? Or would you even sacrifice your life? Sacrifice is news. Freedom. Sacrifice sometimes leads to freedom. The freedom of speech, the freedom from oppression, and the freedom to search for truth. Freedom is news.
Hi, welcome to the Newseum in Arlington, Virginia, and to the Newseum studio. This is In Search of Truth, a live interactive tour of the world's only interactive museum of news. The Newseum explores the story of news. How do we get it? How do we report it? And what do you do when you receive it? I'm Gene Policinski with the Freedom Forum and the Newseum, and with me today in the studio is Deborah Mathis, correspondent in the Washington Bureau of Gannett News Service. Also in the studio today are students from Chantilly High School in Virginia and from Eastern High School in the District of Columbia. We're glad to have you here. We're going to go on a great tour today. One of the things that we'll explore, and I think the basic thing, is the idea of the search for truth and what it means. And Deborah, as a working journalist, why do you search for the truth?
You know, sometimes I ask myself that because it's a pain to search for truth. It's much easier to just search for information, one side or the other, or both, or all three sides, or whatever. But truth is a much higher standard than that. It's the ultimate get. It's what you want really to make, it answers the question we heard in the introduction about how as kids we ask our mothers, our fathers, why this, why that? That's what we ultimately need to know in order to make the best decisions, the best judgments to move forward, is the truth, not just both sides. So it's a tough job searching for truth, and not all journalists believe that that's their job.
Yeah. Thanks, Deborah. We're going to be going to you for questions, but we're going to go to the studio right now. Deborah's going to go out and see if we can't get a response from someone in the studio as to why, as a student journalist or as a student who uses the news, do they search for the truth? We have a person right here who will be glad to tell us why they think the truth is important.
You have an answer already.
I feel like it's just as important for student journalists as professional journalists to be committed to the truth. I think basically that's where the whole integrity of the profession lies, and especially for those interested in pursuing a career in journalism, they need to learn to be thorough and correct and report the truth to the best of their ability.
We'll take her.
All
already.
right. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Now we're going to begin our tour. Let's go to Christina Smekens, who's at the Newseum's News History Wall, where she'll look at how news has evolved over the years.
Thanks, Gene. Hello out there to everybody. I'm Christina Smekens. I'm a newspaper advisor at Huntington North High School in Huntington, Indiana. I'm here with Megan Engel, a student journalist from Greenwood High School in Greenwood, Indiana. Now, before we start our tour, let's talk a little bit about the field trip. We'd love for this to be participative and interactive. We want you to call in with questions and give us some answers and feedback to the things you see on our tour. You can call us at 1-800-566-1115 or email us at outreach@bsuvc.bsu.edu. Now let's get started. We're standing in front of this enormous history wall and directly in front of the electric chair that killed Ruth Snyder in 1928, when she and her lover were found guilty for strangling her husband. Now, it's interesting that she was one of the first and only women ever executed, but even more interesting is that this tabloid ran the front page with this screaming headline of "Dead" the next day. What happened was a photographer had a mini camera strapped to his ankle, and he simply lifted his pant leg up when the switch was flipped, when the switch was flipped, and took a photo. Now we have here, mounted on this handrail, a mini cam similar to the one that was used in that instance, and we can see what kind of image that we're getting from here.
Well, what's so interesting, Christina, is that much of the technology that we feel is new today really has been around for several years, similar to the cigar camera, and just like journalism. In fact, news has spanned clear back to the 1600s all the way to the present, similar to this wall.
In the 1600s, we had our first newspapers emerge. They were the weekly papers, and then we moved into some daily newspapers. In the 1700s, we moved to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, freedom of expression, and free press.
In the 1800s, we had the introduction of photojournalism, similar to this picture seen here, which was one of the first ever captured and shows the destructive fire in Hamburg, Germany. Next, we move into the 1850s with the introduction of the telegraph and AP wires, which controlled news output from coast to coast.
In the 1900s, Joseph Pulitzer, many of us have heard his name. He's the one that brought us eyewitness reporting, the 5 W's and H, packing the story in the first paragraph full of information. We move into one of only 9 wooden printing presses still in existence in the U.S., and then the linotype machine. The Newseum has one of only those few remaining.
And now we begin our journey into the later years of journalism. We start with the 1930s and Henry Luce, who was one of the co-fathers of Time magazine, which was indeed one of the first modern news magazines. In his empire, he also had Life, Fortune, and Sports Illustrated. Here you can see some of the front cover pages of the first news magazines in America.
As we walk through the decades, we leave the 1930s, we walk into the 1940s. That brings us to the radio. As you can see here in this display, some of these microphones are really more like a macro microphone. They're very large, bulky, and flagged with the call letters of the station. They were like centerpieces on the desks of the broadcasters. In this time frame, we also have David Sarnoff. He was a ringleader in utilizing the telegraph, the radio, and then eventually was the co-founder of the National Broadcasting Company. We see where newspapers had to try to compete with the deadlines and how it was going to impact the reporting. Here we see a newspaper famous for the wrong reason. When the presidential race, the results came after the paper went to bed, showing that Dewey was the winner.
Next, we move into the flickering of TV news. We start with NBC's introduction of one of the first news programs, which was hosted by John Cameron Swayze and was the Camel News Caravan. Next, we also have one of the first televised presidential debates between Kennedy and Nixon. For those who listened to the radio, they would tell you that Nixon was the winner, but those who actually watched it televised would tell you that clearly Kennedy was the winner due to his presence. 60 Minutes was also introduced in this time period. We also see newspapers trying to play catch-up with TV stations in their coverage of the Kennedy assassination. and also their extremely large photo of Kennedy's killer, Lee Harvey Oswald's body after the autopsy.
As we move out of the 60s into the 70s, we see women in the news, women making the news, women reporting the news. We have Helen Thomas. We have dear Abby and Ann Landers, twin sisters who are columnists. We work with Barbara Walters and Diane Sawyer. We start to see cable TV, then we see CNN, and now we have the internet. We start to hear hate, violence, and crime on TV. We have the shuttle disaster, the Oklahoma City bombing. A lot of our viewers, a lot of our readers, they start to question, are we doing too much? Are we covering too much? Are we going way too far? We're going to go to Eric Newton in the Freedom Park, and he's going to talk to us about some of those early pioneers. Eric?
Thanks, Christina. I'm standing out here in Freedom Park, which is a 1.6 acre span of greenery and exhibits devoted to the struggle for people around the world to preserve humankind's most precious right, freedom. But what good is freedom without free flow of news? That's where news pioneers come in. Before I tell the story of Ida B. Wells, the pioneer behind me, let me remind you that this is an interactive field trip. It's as interactive as you want to make it. So get active, get to the phones, and start calling in, or email your questions to the website. Ida B. Wells. In 1892, 3 men were lynched in Memphis. Ida B. Wells investigated and learned that the men were not lynched because they were criminals. They were lynched because they were successful black businessmen. She wrote a story in her newspaper, the Memphis Free Speech, and editorials were so fiery that mobs formed to chase her out of town. Ida B. Wells continued to crusade against the wrongful lynchings of black men and brought us all news and brought us a little closer to the truth about what was really going on in our own country. This wall is full of different pioneers here, Frederick Douglass, James Gordon Bennett, and Thomas Paine. But I'd like to talk to you about one other one, Benjamin Franklin. Now, Benjamin Franklin started out in journalism when he was 16. He was putting out his brother's newspaper, the New England Courant. By the time he was 23, he owned his own newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, and he made it the best in the colonies. Ben Franklin wrote, either do things worth writing about or write things worth reading. He's one of the most famous of our news pioneers, and he went on to own a chain of newspapers. You know, news swirls all around us, but it's hard to know, of all that news, what is true. Gene and Deborah will help us out with that.
Thanks, Eric. Welcome back to the studio. We know from surveys that have been done by the Freedom Forum and the Newseum and others that many people today, including some of you watching and some of you here in the studio, just don't believe everything that you read and see and hear. You don't hold the press in high regard. Well, 25 years ago, that was a little different. The press had a peak moment. They were on a high. Some hard work by reporters for the Washington Post and others led to the resignation of a president.
From the discussions I have had with congressional and other leaders, I have concluded that because of the Watergate matter, I might not have the support of the Congress that I would consider necessary. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The president now at the door. A final wave.
When that incident happened, the press was believed and trusted. But again, for some reason today, that's not the case. Deborah, we'd like to hear from those of you in the studio with Deborah and also those of you on the 800 number about what do you believe when you read things and see things and hear things?
Okay, and first we're going to ask Shane in Cascade what he thinks about that. Shane?
Can you tell us when were the first satellite feeds used?
Oh, the first satellite feeds. Oh boy, you would throw us for a loop right away. Let me tell you this. This would have been first satellites in the way that we know them now. I believe might have been somewhere in the early 80s as we use them now, because or maybe No, before that, a little before that, late 70s, I think, because I remember us going live. When live television, we could actually go out in the street somewhere instead of roll a big studio camera out. So the satellites that we were using would have come into commercial use, widespread commercial use, somewhere in the late 70s. Although, you know, there were a few exceptions and experiments before that. But tell us while we have you on the line, if you don't mind, Shane, do you believe the press these days? Are you there? Oh, I guess he doesn't. I'm sitting here, but let me say this, Gene. I'm sitting here with all these kids who I know have strong opinions, and of course I'm blending in real well with this young group. What do you think? Do you trust us?
Well, it depends on like what the news does, because sometimes they drown a story, like Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky and everything. They sort of like drowning it to death, and people get tired of it. But if you like, but I believe the press because they mostly tell the truth. So.
Okay, great. Thanks.
We have a phone call, Deborah. We have Joni from Lawrence North High School. Go ahead, Joni.
Joni, we're ready for you, Joni. Joni, if you'll turn down your television set a little bit, we have some serious feedback. Are you there?
Sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Oh, we have a... Am I still there?
Yes, go ahead, Johnny.
Okay. See, we had a question about Dewey, because she said Dewey won,
Right.
That was a famous...
but we thought Dewey lost.
Well, you're right. And, I'll tell you what happened there was that the man who owned...
Hold on, we can't hear you through our TV.
The man who owned the Chicago Tribune, Colonel McCormick, Colonel McCormick, was such an advocate and such a supporter of the Republican nominee Dewey that the news that was reported in Chicago basically was always positive that he was going to be Truman. And really almost every expert in the country said that. It came down to deadline, and the copy editor who was writing headlines for the front page of the Chicago Tribune didn't know how the local races had turned out or the state races had turned out. So he basically said to himself, well, the only one I really know, it's absolutely certain, is that Dewey's going to beat Truman. And so that's what they put in their first editions, and of course, it didn't happen that way. So that's a case where it was in print, and if you saw it, you shouldn't have believed it.
Okay, now let's take one more call, Jane, from Eric from Bishop Luers. Eric?
Hello?
Hi, go ahead. You have a question?
Is this me?
I think so.
Hi.
You're on.
Hey, who am I talking to?
This is Deborah Mathis, Gene Policinski, and the world.
Oh, yeah?
You have a question for us?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do you like being in journalism?
Oh, you would ask the $64,000 question. I've been doing this for 27 years professionally, and actually since I was 14 years old, I've been where I was editor of my junior high school newspaper and then moved to be editor of my senior high school newspaper and then straight to work. I've been in it for a long time now, so I guess the answer might be yeah. Gene?
Well, I've been in it for about 30 years, and I just have a great time. I think there's nothing quite like being a reporter and editor and being involved in the daily flow of the news. We need to move on to another spot in the Newseum. We're going to go to Christina, who's now where the Newseum displays every day front pages from 50 states and from around the world. And she'll talk a little bit also about how deadlines impact news. Christina?
Thanks, Gene. I'm standing here on the second floor of the Newseum in the Interactive Center, and on the back wall are 70 front pages that come over the internet daily. And every morning before the Newseum even opens, they will display these in showcases. We have selected 6 today that seem to be all carrying the same top 3 stories: the death of James Earl Ray, the Susan McDougal story, and the father who gave his son tainted blood with the HIV virus, so he wouldn't have to pay child support. Well, let's look at this first one here from Long Island, where it's a tabloid-sized paper. They give James Earl Ray the top story, the only story on the front page. But we move into the Dayton Daily News, where James Earl Ray gets top billing also, but a little bit smaller. And the deadbeat dad, a little bit of editorialization there, falls a little bit lower. We'll move over here to Nevada in the Reno Gazette-Journal, and we see that the dad has top billing. James Earl Ray falls a little bit lower. We move to St. Louis, where James Earl Ray has the dominant package, and Susan McDougall's Nothing But a Mugshot here at the bottom. Moving to our fifth example, in Alaska. As far away as Alaska, James Earl Ray still makes the bottom left corner and a little bit lower, the father who injected his son with the HIV virus. Our last example here is the Star Tribune from Minneapolis. McDougall, top right. Ray gets the top part of the story here. We're going to move just across from me here to the Interactive Center, where Megan is working on one of the interactive sites called Be a Reporter. Now, many of you had received this via email, or your advisors had informed you, or you checked out our website, and she's working on a story here. Megan, where are we in the process of filing this story?
Well, right now we're interviewing people at the salvage company that supposedly took the contaminated cheese from the school.
Great. We're going to let Megan go ahead and continue filing this story while we take a phone call from Heather. Heather, go ahead. Heather?
Made.
Hello.
When was the first yearbook made?
Well, as a newspaper advisor, I'm not quite sure when the first yearbook was made, but I would say in our school, when our school first opened, ever since the school first opened, they had a yearbook. And so I would say when the schools began, the yearbooks began also. Lori, you're on the air next. Thanks, Heather. Lori, go ahead. Lori, go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering, how exactly will this museum benefit student journalists?
Lori asked how the Newseum will benefit student journalists, and I'll tell you, as a newspaper advisor, this would be, if money was no object, I would bring my kids here every single year. Every single class would be here. You find out about ethics, truth, accuracy, reporting, what there is and is not supposed to be in the media. The Newseum has professionals, it has student journalists, it has all different kinds of media. So the Newseum is benefiting all different kinds of journalists. I think we have one more call here. Go ahead.
Hello?
Hello, go ahead, you're on the air.
This is Iggy from Northrop.
Hello,
I have
Iggy.
a question.
Yes.
Around the 1800s, 1900s, there were several black issues concerning about slavery and such. And I was wondering if those are considered newspapers. If so, how come we haven't heard a lot about them?
How come we haven't, I didn't quite understand your question. How come we didn't hear about them?
During slavery, during the Civil War, there were several black newspapers. I was wondering if those are considered newspapers, since they were concerned about freedom and such.
I think we're just trying to glaze over some things here, and I think all different kinds of news that was reported is considered a newspaper or some kind of news media. And so, yes, I do feel that those are part of our media history. We're going to go ahead and send this right to Eric in the Freedom Forum, because he's going to talk about some of these past journalists at our Journalist Memorial. Eric?
Hi, Christina. You know, in the nation's capital, there are monuments to presidents and to foot soldiers, monuments of all kinds. But I'm here at a monument of a different sort. It's the Freedom Forum Journalist Memorial, a spiral of glass and steel where the names of more than 1,000 journalists are enshrined. What did they do? They died in the line of duty. All around the world, journalists put themselves at risk. Sometimes their job just puts them in dangerous places. Other times, they're actually murdered for what they report. Now, this isn't ancient history. This is about the 90s. This is about today. This is about Veronica Guerin in Ireland. She stopped at a stoplight, and a motorcycle pulls up next to her, shoots 3 shots, and she's dead. She leaves a young child and her husband. This is about Dan Eldon, a brilliant young photographer in Somalia who is stoned to death because he belongs to the news media. It's about Indiana's own Ernie Pyle, who was one of the most popular columnists during your parents' generation during World War II. His popularity didn't prevent him from being killed. He was shot down by a Japanese sniper on the island of Iwo, right in the middle of World War II. And the troops erected a plaque on the spot that said, the 77th has lost a buddy, Ernie Pyle. Now, all these journalists had the one thing in common. that they died in the line of duty. They are different from each other in every other respect. And this memorial changes color during the day as the light changes, because it's made of dichroic glass, and the colors flickering here are like the flags of their nations or the flames of their passions. Now we've got a call coming in now. We'd like to take it. It's Patty from Fairfax. Hello, Patty.
Yes, hi. My question was, why was the press trusted more in the 60s than today?
Well, trust of the press has bounced up and down over the years. It's true that people today don't trust journalists as much as they have in the past. But you know, because news is so large and complex, people will often trust the news that they choose out of the news stream. They put together their own little diet of news, and they do tend to trust that. But part of it has to do with all the tabloid-style reporting that we have going on these days, where we have tabloids and radio talk show hosts that act like tabloids and television programs that act like tabloids. And so people see more and more examples of bad reporting and therefore have a lower opinion of journalists. Another question from Chris. Are you there?
Why do we get two different versions of a story at times, and then we don't know who to believe at different times of the same story?
That's a great question. What happens is journalists sometimes get it wrong. In their rush to deadline, they make mistakes. Sometimes some journalists are better than others and get it right more often. Sometimes someone has told them something, lied to them, and completely misled them. Now, what good journalists try to do is get more than one source for their information. And so what a good news consumer like you should try to do is consume your news from more than one source and read those stories carefully. Don't just look for statements of opinion, but look for the facts that back up those statements. We've got another one from Christy from Cascade. What's your question, Christy?
You know, reporters, if they don't have the whole story, do they make it up as they go?
Well, that's a commonly asked question. Do we just make up the news? Historically, there have always been journalists who cared more about entertaining people than they did care about the truth. But there are also journalists who care more about the truth. And these here on the memorial are examples of people who actually gave their lives so that you would know more about the world. It's a difficult thing to think about what you would sacrifice. What would we sacrifice today for an idea like this? What would we sacrifice in our search for the truth? Back to you, Gene and Deborah.
Thanks, Eric. I think the Journalist Memorial is one of the more moving places that you can visit when you're here at the Newseum. Thankfully, the role of a journalist for student journalists and most journalists throughout the business doesn't involve giving up your life, but it does mean that many times the price can be very painful or very steep. Since the Supreme Court decision for student journalists, a Supreme Court decision in the late 1980s called Hazelwood has led some school officials to clamp down and censor newspapers and prevent things from being printed. We have an example of one story. In this story, a student reporter last year was prevented from writing about a shoplifting incident that happened on a school field trip. And eventually that story was printed elsewhere. I think we'd like to hear from those of you in the studio and those of you calling in on the 800 line or sending us an email, and tell us about stories that you've been involved in that have been controversial or that have been very sensitive and that you've had either some difficulty or been able to get into print.
We've got a student journalist over here that was pointed out to me. I don't know whether she has had any difficulty with censorship, but I bet she's had some problems with at least some controversial issues, haven't you? Tell us your name, too.
My name's Meg. We had a story last year about the conditions of our bathrooms, and we printed a story on it that some people found offensive, and it was a very controversial issue.
Controversial why? What made
it was very graphic about the stuff about the conditions of our bathrooms they're not very nice, and they're just not very sanitary, and we wrote we wrote pretty graphically on that, and it was debated whether we should print it or not, and we decided to print it.
Good for you. Did you get much hassle from the school?
Not much.
But you, well, good, good. Hang in there.
We have a phone call.
You got a
Deborah?
call from Nick from Snyder? Nick?
Yeah.
Let's hear from
Today's
you.
changing society with the internet and the expanding technology.
Yeah.
You feel conventional newspapers will grow obsolete, giving way to up-to-the-minute broadcasts?
Do we think that newspapers will be able to
Will be obsolete, I think.
will be obsolete? Oh my goodness. Well, you know, that's the eternal argument that's going on now with news in the newspaper world, in the print media world especially. Electronic technology, broadcast technology, and all, and those two are really kind of hurting us, in those of us who are in print. But the belief is that there will still be those who will always want the tactile relationship with the newspaper, to feel it in their hands, fold it up and put it in their briefcases, open it up and bump somebody out of the way on the subway. Whatever you do with that newspaper, pull it, save it for later, and also to get the depth that newspapers often can afford to give you that broadcast news cannot. The internet is a whole different ball game because it kind of marries the immediacy of broadcast news and the depth, or no limits, that newspapers at least used to have and would still like to have now. It can go on, but there are some dangers with the internet because you have to know where it's coming from and try to verify those sources. Jane?
Thank you, Deborah. I think we have another caller. Tiffany, I believe you're on the line.
Role of paparazzi or stalkerazzi in today's media?
I'm sorry, we can only get part of your question. Could you repeat that, please?
Sure. I was wondering how the new museum handles the role of paparazzi or stalkerazzi in today's media.
Well, I think you have to look at the traditional role of a news photographer and say that, to some degree, photography is always intrusive, and particularly in delicate situations. And whenever there's a photograph taken, it's a permanent record. And sometimes when the news isn't good, those people who are in the news would always like to have it sort of go away, and a picture makes it permanent. We've looked at the issue here, and we have discussions every day. We bring journalists in, photographers, writers, editors, reporters, and talk about those kinds of things with people who visit the museum. So if you're here in person, you can sit in this television studio and often ask a person whose job it is to take those photographs why they do it. I think the short answer is that it's news. We have a question from Melissa at Elmhurst.
Go, Melissa. You're on. Go ahead, Melissa.
How important is it for the press to report the personal life of the president?
Oh, boy. I guess everybody heard that one. How important is it for the press to report the personal life of the president? Well, Melissa, let me say, if you can find the answer to that one, send it up here to Washington quickly, because that's the thing. All the professionals are having just panel discussions and seminars and conferences and writing editorials and columns and everything about that. We don't know is really the answer. We aren't sure. We know something in our guts kind of tells us, and that's an important thing to use as a journalist. Something in our guts is telling us, we ought to know something about that the public has a right, but we don't know where the limits are, so maybe we're overdoing it.
Thanks, Deborah. And now we're going to move back to Eric in Freedom Park, who's at the South African ballot box there. And he's going to take a look at the events and some of the icons that have helped break down barriers to freedom all around the world.
Thanks, Gene. The thirst for freedom still burns in this country and throughout the world. That thirst led us through a revolution, the fight in the Civil War, and the fight for civil rights. Now I'm here with the real deal here, a ballot box from South Africa. 43 million people, black South Africans, got to cast their votes in ballot boxes just like these around the country in 1994 when the all-white rule of apartheid ended. This is just one of the icons that are of freedom that are out here in Freedom Park. Up at the top of the park, there's Native American stones in a circle. Those represent the talking circle, where if you had a stick or a stone, you would be the speaker, and then those were passed around the circle, and whoever had them could talk. We also have suffrage banners from the 1920s. Women used their own newspapers to win the right to vote in this country. There's also a jail cell door. And that little concrete pad is Martin Luther King's jail cell size when he's in the Birmingham jail. And there's a raft from Cuba. Even the water between our countries couldn't keep the Cubans from knowing what life was really like in the United States, and this man built the boat, and he and his wife came across to Florida. Now I'm standing here at these ghetto stones from Germany. During the World War II, Jews were forced into ghettos. These ghetto stones symbolize the survival of those who managed to escape before being sent to Nazi death camps. They took their stories, wrote them down, and buried them in cans beneath this stone so we know what has happened. I also see here the headless Lenin statue from the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, statues of communist heroes fell upon hard times. And this statue's been brought over from the Soviet Union, weighs several tons. The head, no one knows where it went. And finally, here's the Berlin Wall. There isn't a better symbol of the victory of freedom over censorship than these wall pieces. Each one weighs several tons. They represent fantastic accomplishment in East German construction technology. This is the fourth example of how tall the wall got, and it snaked like a concrete python through the city of Berlin, the only wall ever designed to keep a nation's residents locked within. Now this piece of this wall and the other two pieces behind, they were strong enough and big enough to stop a tank, but they couldn't stop the truth from getting into East Berlin about what life was really like in the West. And so the people of East Berlin rose in protest almost 10 years ago, and the wall came down. Gene and Deborah?
Thanks, Eric. We're standing next to the newest kind of media that we look at here, and I think there was a question earlier. We'd like to obviously continue to encourage you, those of you who are calling in and messaging. Hang with us. We'll try to get to your questions. When we look at the internet, I think it raises a whole new question about the search for truth, because really, what is that? The traditional news organizations have had time to set some standards and set some expectations on your part as to what is true or not on them. On the web, that's not really the case, and I think if there's a single individual who is the lightning rod for the controversy and the discussion about the web, it's a columnist, a cyber reporter called Matt Drudge. Drudge reports the news. I think he once said that if he's about 80% right, he feels pretty good about that. And I don't know if that's a standard that most traditional news organizations would accept, but it's good enough for him. And certainly one of the things that we're going to have to do as we look at new technology is to try to evaluate how good a job does it do for us. That raises a whole ethical situation, and we're going to go to Christina now, who's at the Ethics Center.
Hello, I'm here at the Ethics Center in the Newseum, where every day we realize, student journalists, that you are making difficult decisions, whether it's in your newspaper, in your magazine, in your yearbook, with your broadcast, or the click of every shutter of your camera. You have difficult decisions to make. A code of ethics should guide that decision. And here in the Newseum, they have an interactive center where you can sit down and with the touch of a screen, you can read about real cases and make your own personal ethical decisions, whether or not you would run the story, print the photo, or change the layout of the paper and give top billing to a different story. In the studio is Deborah and Jean and Megan, and they are going to challenge themselves with one of these real cases. Guys?
Thanks, Christina. Megan, you're going to work on one of these ethics cases here, and why don't you go ahead and what happens here is you get to read a situation and then you make a decision about what you would do. In this case, in 1992, you're the sports editor of a major newspaper and you're faced with this ethical dilemma. You know that a world-famous sports star has AIDS, and you have to decide whether you're going to pursue the story or not. Megan's making her choice, and you're about to click on what you would do, and you've chosen, I think, to not pursue it. And Megan, could you tell us why you made that choice?
Well, yes, as a journalist, I believe I often take in my personal beliefs and how I would feel in a certain situation, and in this situation, I would not feel comfortable with the public being aware of my medical condition without my family knowing first.
Okay, well, I think journalists are often called upon to write stories about people and their health, and we'd like to hear from you, and we'd like to hear from our guests in the studio as to what they might do on a story like this.
What do you think you would do? Your name is Joelle? Yes. You are in 9th grade now. You haven't had to deal with many issues like that, decisions about someone else's life, but imagine you have the power to tell the world about something that the world will no doubt be interested in, but should you tell that this very famous, popular athlete has AIDS?
Yes, I would tell that he has AIDS because I feel that everyone should have to tell people that. I know he probably would feel he wouldn't want anyone to know, but I would tell because I feel that everyone should know.
So that would be your duty as a journalist, you think, to
I would tell.
Okay, I want to ask somebody behind you a minute, if we can, back here. What about you? You're a guy, you know the athlete thing. What would you do?
I wouldn't tell because I wouldn't want nobody to know if I had AIDS if I was that popular.
Okay, now you are thinking the way, I find this interesting, the way Megan thought. And I must say, I applaud both of you. Jean and I will disagree on this. I believe that you should lead with your own humanity. That's what I call it. To try and step in the other shoes and to think, all right, maybe I have this information and maybe I have a duty, but what purpose am I serving, and does the purpose that I serve override the damage that I cause? That's what I think is the question that some of these kids are answering. But Jean has a comrade in arms here sitting next to me, and Joelle. Jean?
Well, Joelle, thank you. I think I should tell you, since we're searching for the truth, that I was the managing editor at USA Today when that Ash story broke, and it was my decision to go ahead and pursue that story, and ultimately to go ahead and print that story when Arthur made his statement. And I did that because I felt it was news. I think he was one of the great figures of the 20th century, and that the fact that he was ill, regardless of the kind of disease, was news and it needed to be printed. But there was plenty of disagreement. I must say that there were many people, like our guest in the studio, who said, I don't think that kind of illness is anybody's business. So the Newseum Ethics Center has that question, as we mentioned, and I think it started out heavily no, and it's now come to about 50-50, so the studio is pretty representative. We have a general question right now, I think maybe not on this topic, from Chris. Go ahead, Chris.
What a popular cover for a newspaper would be? Color?
I'm sorry, well, popular cover or color?
Color.
Color for a newspaper.
Like a flashy color that would get someone's attention.
Well, if you want to look at what you're seeing, red, blue, I mean, you know, those are the colors that are definitely getting attention, you know, and this is a relatively new thing. In your young lives, you have probably grown up with color in newspaper. In my life, and I'm not that old, but I'm old enough, where in my lifetime, this is a new occurrence, this all of this color all over the place. And it is because we are a different society. We kind of demand more now, and we want you to win us over, even if you're a newspaper. So, and the color can be wonderful. It certainly can lend a lot to the photographs and to the overall presentation of the newspaper or the magazine. But don't forget that ultimately it's the content that we have to really care about.
Okay, we need to go to a question from Jennifer at Muncie Central, I believe. I guess that's a question from Muncie Central with Jennifer in front of the microphone, right. But go ahead, Jennifer.
How can we, as a new generation of student journalists, continue to express the freedom that we are now seeing at the Newseum against the restrictive school administration that does not support any of the subjects that we run in our publications?
Well, that's a question I think that has to be solved school by school in many ways. But one of the things I think is to focus on the basics. I've found that many times student journalists will focus on large issues, and if you ignore very basic issues like accuracy and preciseness, that it weakens your argument. So I would start there. One of the great arguments for a story is that it's true and that your report is accurate. We're running just a bit behind, and we need to move on. Unfortunately, we have a lot of questions, but hang in there. There'll be some other opportunities to ask us some questions and give us some thoughts. But right now, let's go to the Newseum's Executive Director, Joe Urschel, who's going to talk for a moment about whether you can and how do you know what you see is truthful.
How do you recognize the truth? And if you read it, is it so? Hi, I'm Joe Urschel, Executive Director of the Newseum, and I'm standing here at our News Globe, which contains the nameplates of 1,841 different newspapers, every American daily, and several hundred foreign and national dailies as well. On the wall behind me are mottos from hometown newspapers across the country, mottos from the New York Times like, all the news that's fit to print, or the Atlanta Journal, which claims to cover Dixie like the Dew, or the more candid Arlington Heights Herald, which says its aim is to fear God, tell the truth, and make money. Early in the nation's history, you couldn't really believe what you read in the newspapers because they were journals of opinion. Their stories were not as credible as they are today because they were based on opinion and not on fact. As we approached the 20th century, papers got bigger and more varied, but still they were infected with opinion. Editors would sensationalize the news to help boost their circulation. This type of journalism came to be referred to as yellow journalism. As we approached the 19th century, though, accuracy and objectivity became the watchwords. Circulation soared as editors tried to be more objective in their coverage. Recently, though, in the post-Watergate and Vietnam era, we've seen the believability of the media plummet. Newspaper believability is believed to be at one of its lowest ebbs ever. Polls tell us that television is thought to be a little more believable, but if you're seeing it, is it really more true? Let's go to Gene now at the Capitol and test that question. Is seeing believing?
Thanks, Joe. I'm here at the Capitol on a beautiful spring day, and we'll be talking about is seeing believing. I think it's the biggest question in the news today is whether you can really believe what you see on the screen. You know, we were in front of the Capitol building, but we weren't. We're here at the Newseum in an area called the Interactive Exhibits, and we're actually standing in an area where you can be a newscaster in front of what's called a blue screen. It's called a chroma key. Behind me is a screen which will accept a lot of images. I could have been at the Capitol building, I could have been at the White House, which is right next door in the Newseum, or I could have been at the zoo, or just about anywhere else you want to be. It's the way they put your evening newscast together. Many times, when they're in front of the weather map, weathercaster is actually pointing to the blue screen and having to use a television monitor to track where he's pointing and where that weather's coming from. I think we all learned at an early age that seeing is believing, that one picture's worth 1,000 words and you can trust your eyes. But I think a caution in the new electronic world is to always test where is that image coming from? How honestly are these people reporting over time? Because if you can't believe the exact image you're seeing right now, you can often build a record of trust with a news organization or a reporter who you know will tell you the truth. We're going to go to Christina, who will show you some other images on the video wall of Is Seeing Believing.
Thanks, Gene. I'm standing here on the 3rd floor looking over the interactives at this huge, enormous, awesome video wall. It's a 9-screen video wall with 126 feet of screen, 10.5 feet tall. It shows you 9 different broadcasts coming in live, but each of the 9 screens could break down into 4 different quadrants, revealing 36 different broadcasts at the same time. We've got NBC, CBS, ABC. We have MSNBC, ESPN, ESPN2, CNN, C-SPAN, you name it, they've got it. They've got over 400 different feeds coming into the Newseum every single day, all the time. Now, some of these shows are live. Most of them are live. Some of them come in as taped segments that are on a loop, and one that just finished here that usually catches a lot of interest with the visitors is an NBA report where they show the behind-the-scenes cameramen and how it works, and the idea that they have 14, 15, 16 different cameras all stationed around the court, and a director kind of acting like the pilot of a plane saying which camera is going to be aired on TV. We're going to go to Eric, Gene, and Deborah back down at Freedom Park at the Journalist Memorial, and we're going to wrap it up. Guys?
We've moved out to the park from the studio, and Megan and Deborah are with Eric and I now. And we'd like to take some more questions. So I think we have Beth on the line. Go ahead, Beth.
Oh, hi. I was wondering who came up with the idea for the Newseum and when did it open?
The Newseum was the idea of some people at the Freedom Forum about 1991, and first it was an idea of where could journalists go and sort of put their papers and have a museum of their own that would be more kind of a record of things. And then it grew through the years to involve taking the message of journalism to the public. The Newseum itself opened on April 18th of 1997, so just about a year ago.
Misty from Cascade, I think, is on the line. Are you there, Misty?
Yeah.
Let's hear your question.
What classes in high school and college do you need to take to become a journalist?
Well, that's a very good question. Obviously, you want to take some journalism, but you know, in high school, I would really concentrate on English a lot. In college, where you have to actually choose, and I say English because you need to understand the language and grammar and writing and creative writing and composition. You need to make sure you have those things down so that when you have a story to tell, you'll be able to tell it well. In college, then, I would go and obviously take some journalism courses. I wouldn't necessarily worry about majoring in journalism as much as I would trying to concentrate on a particular issue, politics, history, science, because I think the wave of the future for journalists is going to be specialty reporting.
Okay, we have Crystal from Lafayette Jeff on the line.
Yes, I was wondering how you could tastefully report death in a paper or an article.
Crystal, I think we had a bit of a difficulty hearing you. Could you try that one again?
I think I heard her.
How can you tastefully report
How can you
news?
tastefully report death in news? It can be tricky, but it also can be done. It's always a tough thing for journalists, especially when it's a real tragedy, when there's a child involved, when there's a famous figure involved that is going to move or disturb a lot of people, the news of his or her death. But it certainly can be done if there's not too much intrusion on the survivors, I think. I think that's what offends people more than anything else, or if there's too much negative talk about that person's life at the beginning. I think we all need a little bit of time before we get into the whole story. At first, the way Americans are at least, we want to show a little reverence for the newly departed.
Okay, we have Gara from Concordia with a question.
Hi, do you feel that female photojournalists have as much opportunity in this field as male, and do you feel they receive as much respect?
Well, I think we have an obvious place to go with that question.
Yes. No. No. Women photojournalists have been around. Some of the greats of our time have been women and have captured some of the most unforgettable images of all history. So obviously we have the talent to do it and the ability to do it. I don't think, first of all, there are enough women who are looking into the field. We need to kind of flood the market, if you will. But it's more and more now. Around here, you see those big hordes of photographers and everything. You'll see quite a few tough women in there. Now, you do have to be pretty tough because you're going to see some stuff up very close and that's kind of rough to see sometimes. And you have to have good elbows as well and good knees for all the climbing over things you're going to have to do. So the field is open. It's not as open as it needs to be for women, but I think more women will make a difference.
Okay, I have a question actually for those of us here, and that is that often I found that people in public life or in their careers have a motto or a saying that guides them, and I'd like to know, Christina, by the way, has joined us after a quick jog up from the video wall. Good to have you out here in the park. But what personal motto has guided all of us? Let's start with Eric, that gives you some guidance in your career.
You want the truth now, I guess.
The truth. We're searching for the truth.
Well, to be honest, there was a guy in Chicago about 100 years ago named Wilbur Story, and he said, print the news and raise hell. And I've always loved that motto. I like journalism that has an impact. I'm not talking about opinions, but I am talking about journalism where the facts make a difference and change things because of the work that we do.
Deborah, quickly?
Well, I'd have to say live first, I guess. That is, rather than just sticking with what the textbook said and what mama told you or whatever, get out there, live life a little bit more. It helps put a lot of things in context once you've been through it, and context is important in good reporting.
Okay. Christina, you have kind of a dual life in journalism. You are a teacher and a practitioner of journalism. What's the motto that guides you?
I think for newspapers that come out weekly or monthly or whatever the time frame is, that we need to remember that we won't always scoop people, and so if they haven't heard the story, it's news to them. And so tell the people side of the story to your readers. Don't just tell them the 5 W's and H. Give them the feature side also.
Okay. Well, we'd like to thank you for being with us. You can continue this search by working on the websites that are associated with this program or with the Freedom Forum's own website to let you search through the Newseum again. I'd like to have you search for the truth one more time, and that's the search for the motto that guides you. We've enjoyed being with you today on this tour of the Newseum, and for all of us in Freedom Park, we'd like to thank you for being here and to say goodbye, and we'd also like to challenge you one last time. We'd like you, when you're sitting there, to watch the end of the show and take a look at these mottos and see if you can come up with your own.